Hello and welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery. Today we're going to have a look at the exhibition Sequence, which was curated by Christine DePiero Abbott. So we had a curatorial call and Christine submitted to that and was really interested in presenting printmaking, the contemporary works of Ohio professional printmakers. We have 14 artists from across the state, so ranging from Toledo to Marietta, from Cleveland to Cincinnati. Really, Christine did a phenomenal job of getting folks from all corners of the state. So Christine, tell me a little bit about when you were putting together this proposal, when you were thinking about this exhibition. What were you thinking about? What was really important to you?
Well, Kat, I am a printmaker myself, so really the curating hat is a new role for me, and so I really approached finding artists for this exhibit as an artist. So I was curious. I wanted to know what people were doing here in Ohio, and I was really looking for something new and different, but as a printmaker, I also wanted to kind of touch on each print media as well. With the exhibition, I really was pleased to find really artists were making wonderful prints on all corners of the state. And the first artist, are you?
Well, first of all, hold on, listen.
Okay, help me out.
She's ready to get into the artist, it's great.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit, let's level set for our viewers. Maybe some of them don't know a lot about printmaking. So,
that's a good point.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what makes a print, what makes a printmaker.
I get so excited about printmaking that I'm just ready to dive right in. So prints are very simply, they're created from a surface that's manipulated. That technical term for that is matrix. There's all kinds of surfaces that can be manipulated. Typically inks applied, pressure, and then that surface is transformed into a work of art from that point of impact, and that secondary substrate, traditionally paper, is a print. So again, there's so many different ways to create a print, but some that you might be familiar with. So a relief print is any time that ink is rolled on top of a surface. So a stamp is an example of a relief print. A woodcut, a linoleum cut, those are examples of relief prints. And it's an ancient media. It's been around for thousands of years. Another example of printmaking is silkscreen. Silkscreen is essentially an elaborate stencil. It was initially more of a commercial process, but it's been since adopted by the fine art world. You also have intaglio, which is an umbrella term for any print where the ink is below the surface of typically a plate or the matrix, and then an etching, for example, is a type of intaglio print. Dampened paper, ink, the pressure from a press will then help bring that ink below the surface onto a separate piece of paper. Lithography is another form of printmaking, again used commercially. It uses the fact that oil and water repel each other within the printmaking process. And you'll find in this exhibit that artists are using these different medias in unusual ways, and they kind of take that even the concept of printmaking of one surface to many images, or the idea of a mirror image, concepts related to printmaking as a basis of their artwork as well. And one thing that I really was found as I was doing the research for the exhibit is that most, and where the title came from, Sequence, is most artists really truly worked in a series. They worked by building their ideas up through multiple works that make sense together. One way of thinking about the opposite of that would be artists who make one giant monument or one kind of giant gesture, and that's their work. The artists in this exhibit are not creating work that way. They're creating work, here I am thinking like a printmaker, indirectly. They're kind of thinking around the idea to then describe the idea. And I was really intrigued by the idea of not just artists who work in printmaking, but that also think like a printmaker.
And you have 14 of them here. So I think that's a really great segue, and we can start talking about the artists now. Now, who do we have right here?
This artist, Neil Diagle Orions, pardon for the pronunciation, he is They are new to Cincinnati, just started teaching at the University of Cincinnati, and the works that we have here are both relief and silkscreen. They're inspired by really their personal story, and came from a really vulnerable time when their father was estranged and looking for a way to respond to that experience. So the work is actually made from images from memory. That's the first layers in the work. And then collaged on top are images where the artists, they had put their father's name in a search engine, and then images came up. Faux obituaries came up within this process, and then the artist collaged those two things together. What I think is really worth pointing out with this work is that it kind of speaks to both a personal story. It started with a personal story, but it really speaks to a broader cultural phenomenon where you're trying to where this idea of filling in the gaps or making emotional connections, but using artificial intelligence to do something like that. And I thought that was really interesting as an obituary, that there's really a moment of loss within the process of trying to make a connection via artificial intelligence. So I thought their work was just very timely.
Yeah. Super interesting. Come and have a closer look. And so let's come around the corner and talking about kind of the universal and how things are, like, I love that Neil uses AI on top of memory, on top of searched results. And so I think it's a really great dovetail for Danielle, because there are myriad ways that she is bringing content in. So don't let me steal the thunder, please. Give us the story.
I've got all the thunder. I've got all the thunder. Danielle Runte is an artist who works in Dayton, Ohio. And this body of work is really new for Danielle. Danielle is really well known for doing large-scale landscapes where she places herself she travels regularly. She places herself out kind of in these remote spaces like the Joshua Tree Desert, and then she'll bring the viewer into this sense of vastness or remoteness in her work. So the body of work that we have here is actually created with oxidized metal onto washi paper. That's where you get the color from, and this kind of halo effect, which I think is really unique and beautiful. And the images that Danielle used were originally inspired by the Adena Mounds here in Ohio. So, the Adena Mounds really kind of served as a launching point for the work. But what I really want to point out is both the process and the imagery kind of touches on something that's just very fundamentally human, very elemental. So the printmaking process here is very simple. It really is just a surface that then interacts with the paper, and that's the print. And the images are hands, they're stars, they're something that everybody has interacted with, and they're really about kind of what it means to be human in the larger universe. So I thought it was really interesting, the connection between those two. The other thing I'd like to point out is the silver leaf that she uses. So silver leaf will also oxidize over time, and it kind of provides a nice contrast to the softness of the stars, these kind of clean lines. And this particular piece is really unique in Danielle's work, as she's included a figure. When I think of Danielle, I think of her work, I think of how she puts herself kind of out in these remote spaces. But for me, it's almost, even though it's not truly autobiographical or a self-portrait, but this idea of a kind of vast landscape within. So the figure is described with these kind of concentric shapes, and to me, those really reference topography. They kind of, in a way, kind of intuitively seem back to the idea of the mound. And so for me, it's this almost like this idea of the figure within, or the world within and without, which I find really powerful in Danielle's work.
It also really does a great job of tying back to that landscape. So topography is landscape, right?
Absolutely.
What I really enjoy about these is that the process continues. So as you said, that these will oxidize over time. So now these have not only like a slice of time right now with us where we experience them as they are, but they'll change. So how interesting to think about that.
Well, and again, in a more intuitive way, or kind of again relates to the idea of a sequence. So process being so important to printmakers, and it really is an idea that, you know, connects us all.
Yeah. Let's come on over here. Who do we have here?
This is artist Charles Benecke. He is a professor at the University of Akron, and definitely someone I wanted to, has been a leader in the printmaking world. So he's been past president of printmaking associations, so recognized and led within the overall printmaking community, not just here in Ohio. And the body of work of his that I chose is a unique body of work for Charles. He has done large-scale installations, but I was really attracted to this series titled Notes to Self because of their intimacy. And I really think about them as they're kind of a personal mantra, or something that he kind of tells himself regularly as he's going about his day, going about his creative work. And as someone who has kind of a longevity to their career, I think it's something really important to think about. Like these are the things he's telling himself. Again, kind of going back to the idea of sequence, they make the most amount of sense together, kind of all of these phrases together. Now, if you look at them from the camera, you can't read them. These phrases have been abstracted. So what he's doing is he's printing letter forms using a letterpress process that he's very carefully designed, very carefully printed. His background's also in design, which you can really see in this work. And
I want to interrupt, and I think
thank you.
The one that you're on, come to the middle one here. This one actually, each of the titles are included in that. And that middle one says yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's just all of the letters stacked on top of each other. The one to the left of it says simply focus, and it's all on one line, which I think is really interesting. So there are some design choices that artist has made. Perhaps if it has more than one word, then it expands to, you know, more than stacked on top of each other, right? Like it just, it's really smartly done as you kind of unpack it.
Oh, they're stunning. The other thing too is, as a designer, even kind of the shapes in between the letters, they're intriguing and they're beautiful. The other thing I want to point out is he has some phrases which seem and feel pretty serious, and they're, again, you know, yesterday to today, and tomorrow. That's a kind of a universal thing, a thing to remind ourselves of being here in the moment. But the other thing I want to point out is he does have some phrases in here that are a little sillier, Kat. So this one, eat donuts. So maybe not the advice for everybody, but certainly one that he tells himself. And I think it relates to the bottom one, which is let it go. And for those of you who are familiar, the purple, with this particular phrase, the purple seems like a really appropriate choice.
Yeah. All right. Let's come on around the corner here to our next artist.
So this artist is David Leech. He's another Dayton-based artist, and like most printmakers and many artists, they know each other. So Danielle, who we had just seen her work, she's also in Dayton. Her and David are friends. So David taught for over 30 years at Wright State. And what I really want to point out about his work that I was intrigued by is his process. He really approaches making prints in an unusual way. So the work here, these are silkscreen prints, but unless you looked closely or read how they were made, they really look like drawings. They feel like drawings. And David is someone who I would connect with a group of artists called the Modernists, artists who are really trying to distill down art to some of its kind of most essential elements. So versus throwing in a lot of history and allegory, that kind of everything but the kitchen sink. Instead, they're really trying to distill things down. So what that means is there's a real precision in the way that your eye kind of travels across these pieces. So in order to create these unique textures and this real gestural mark, he uses a pretty unusual material. He uses a power washer. So silkscreen is essentially an elaborate stencil. The commercial process is usually a photo emulsion process, but instead David is applying a material called screen filler to a screen. So imagine a stencil applying this material called screen filler and selecting areas where the ink can pass through the mesh and areas where there's a barrier for the ink to pass through. So wherever he applies this material, it's a barrier for the ink to pass through. And so what he does is he actually brings these screens using a power washer. So he starts to remove, which again, what kind of art materials do you need ear equipment for? So It's not a very elegant tool. But he uses the power washer to create these open areas on the screen where the ink can then pass through. And the power washer will kind of make these almost like gritty openings that are not super precise, and he emphasizes that in his work. And so he'll kind of open areas with the power washer, apply the screen filler, and kind of do this kind of back and forth.
Yeah. Improvisation.
That's right. Yeah, this back and forth approach. And then kind of going back to this idea of precision, and then he's very precise in the kind of ink colors that he chooses. So the one on the far left here is just a really beautiful gray on cream color. It's a little bit more subtle, and it's just really graphic, really beautiful. So we also have works in the show that are etchings, and some of the plates, the metal plates that he uses to create those prints are decades old. He actually will kind of, again, take this back and forth approach, really liking the history that these kind of materials kind of accumulate as they are being worked with in the studio.
Perfect. All right. And our next artist, Jay Garcia in Kent, Ohio.
Yes.
Tell us about Lee's work.
I actually first saw Lee's work up in the Cleveland area at a printmaking conference and fell in love with both Lee and the work. Lee's work is her family story. So Lee is a Texican, from Texas. She's Tex-Mex, so she's a Texan and Mexican.
Her heritage is really important to her.
Yes.
So I think that's really the key, is that she is from Texas, a proud Texan, and her family heritage is Mexican as well. And that's a really important component of what she is creating in her work. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Those two cultures have not, over history, there's been a lot of enmity between those two cultures. And so Lee kind of embraces the fact that she's both, and the fact that the relationship between those two cultures is complicated. So the pieces that we have here refer to her grandfather, so again, her family, and her grandfather laid tile. So the patterns in the tile that were made with paper making, they refer to the space that her grandfather made for her grandmother and the tile that he used. You can see in the images of her grandfather laying tile, and what she's doing by reinterpreting the images with fine art materials here in a gallery context is she's really comparing her, who she is as an artist and relating it to her family story and her grandfather who laid tile, and really saying that there's kind of that real relationship between those creative pursuits. So she also takes unusual materials that she's printing with. So she's collaging images that relate to cooking and food, and again, both Mexican and culture from Texas. And she's printing here on onion papyrus, so paper made from onions. And there are images of her aunts and images of her sisters. So again, her family members, they're really a key part to understanding her work. And they really bring an intimacy to the imagery as well. They really bring a specificity to this story.
I love how this really feels like corn husks that you would see when you unwrap a tamale. Mm-hmm. Like there's just so many levels, even the little red ties, the way that Lee layers in history and context is just really lovely.
And surprising too. You have to look up close. From a distance, it's not entirely apparent, and you come up close and you realize those are onion skins. What she's doing in this particular piece is she's making a connection between preparing, eating with onions, and the process by which they're harvested. And you can see a figure with a conveyor belt, how they're prepared to become in a grocery store. They don't just happen there. And that process often includes folks from the immigrant or the Mexican community as well. So again, her work touches on, there's kind of a warmth in it, but there's also a tension between, and she kind of touches on, again, that kind of more complicated relationship between Texas culture and Mexican culture.
So now we'll come around the corner, and we have Bobby Rosenstock, who lives and works in historic Marietta. You want to tell us a bit about Bobby's work?
Sure. So within this show, Bobby Rosenstock is unique in the fact that he actually runs a commercial press, Just a Jar Press, in downtown historic Marietta. And so his overall body of work, he's made some fantastic band posters. But here in the show, I've showed work.
Like what kind of band posters?
Ooh, that's a good question. Willie Nelson has been a client of his. Jack Daniels is not a band, but it's been a client of his. And you may be familiar with some of the posters he made for the Nelsonville Music Festival. So his work is really playful and fun, but it's also pretty difficult to create. So he does woodcuts, reduction woodcuts, where he'll carve a piece of wood, print a layer of color, continue to carve a piece of wood, print another layer of color, and he may print up to 6 to 7 layers of color. So every time that paper touches the piece of wood, you can imagine there's a chance for a mistake. And in talking to Bobby, I know how meticulous he is about creating his work. That to say, I have 4 works of his in kind of two different but related bodies of work. Here I've got 2 pieces titled The Still Point of the Turning World, 1 and 2, and they were inspired by having to be at home during the lockdown with COVID. So that experience was something that was shared by the state of Ohio, but on the flip side, it was also a very intimate experience. There's an element to it that was not shared with the rest of the world. They were there in their home. There's a real tenderness to these images. If you look closely, you can see their dog is resting. In this piece here, Bobby is playing the banjo. He's a musician. And the way that I kind of think about these works is he's a character in his own story. In his overall larger body of works, he works with characters. He works with stories. And I can imagine the smell of the baking, and there's really kind of a sweetness to the image. I want to point out this right here. This is Rainbow Pigeon. This is Rainbow Kitty. And so this is his daughter's artwork that's here in the image. So it's like art within art. And I've been told that Rainbow Rainbow Pigeon was quite commercially successful as well. But I couldn't just show these works. I also wanted to show other pieces that, and as a parent myself, I know that those kind of sweet, tender scenes don't just magically happen. There's also a part of his work that really talks more about what it means to nurture a family. So here the figure is growing roots, and there's a weight on her back. In other works of his, you'll see that weight, that physical weight, and the growing limbs. The other thing I want to point out is that there's almost a unique family mythology. So most families that I know, they tell stories about their family to help kind of describe to themselves who they are and then the outside world. And so here in Bobby's work, he's using kind of symbols and imagery to tell his family's story. And some of it, the reader may have a connection, or not reader, the viewer has a connection to, and others, they're his family's story, and you're left to wonder.
I love that you said reader, actually, because printing has such a deep history with illustrations and books, and it's so tied. So I think it's a fair kind of drop in. So let's come around to, is it Elana?
Elana Kelly, sorry.
Yeah.
So Elana, again, I'm an artist myself. Eliana's here in Columbus, and she teaches at Ohio Dominican and is a friend of mine. So I print in the same printmaking cooperative, Phoenix Rising Printmaking Cooperative. So I was really familiar with her work, and I really wanted to showcase the life-size pieces that she does. She does these life-size printed, relief printed portraits of her family. She does images from other contexts, but I really wanted to highlight the images of her family, as well as because I know Eliana so well, I know how important her family is to her. So she actually uses wood carving, and she's starting to transition into using more images that are 3D printed. Wood carving's very, very physically demanding, and so she's had to make some changes to her studio practice. But the scale, the sense of intimacy with the work remains the same. The other thing we talked about was having the butterflies or the mariposas in her work and installing them with the pieces. As you know, butterflies are a timeless metaphor for transformation, but what I want to point out is Eliana is not originally from Columbus. She's from Colombia. So she raised her family here in Columbus. She still has family in Colombia, so that kind of north-south and south-north journey is something that she's very familiar with. And there's a connection between that and the monarch butterfly, which uniquely flies north and south. It migrates, not every butterfly flies north and south. So there's a couple connections between Eliana's story, her work, and the butterflies. So they're really important to Colombian culture. They were featured in the book 100 Years of Solitude, which is a really important book by a Colombian author.
It's all right.
Yes.
Some folks can look it up.
Yes, I know his first name's Gabriel, and but anyway, so in the book, there's a character that's always preceded by butterflies, flocks of butterflies. They kind of announce the presence of this character. And so it's important in Colombian culture, but then also, like I was saying, the migration pattern, it happens in generations. Mm-hmm. So, and I really saw a connection between the fact that the butterflies move through generations in Eliana's story and Eliana's work. And I really see the generation that flies the farthest as Eliana herself. That's my own kind of deeper interpretation, again, as someone who knows the artist. And really, that particular butterfly, it's the hardiest, the one that flies the longest. So she's someone who really kind of treasures those connections with her grandparents, and as someone who's really nurtured those connections and raising her family and seeing them go forward in the future.
It's really lovely to have these life-size pieces too. Like it's not easy to make prints this large, and on these lovely translucent silk bits that kind of waft, that there's a movement in there that harkens perhaps to flight. That's really lovely.
And I think the other thing too is there's kind of a sense of they're transitory. There's this connection that with your family, but it's sometimes it is tenuous in the fact that none of us live forever. So I think the material really kind of speaks to that as well.
Well, this is we'll just kind of flip here and come over to Erin Foster, who's in Kent. Tell us about Erin's work. There are kind of some mirroring works, which I think that's really interesting because
yes.
printmaking is a mirroring, right?
Sure, yeah.
And we have two pieces that mirror. I'll stop talking, you go for it.
Erin Foster is an artist who is in the Kent area, but the imagery in the show was actually inspired by more of the Hocking Hills area, and you'll see landscapes. And what I think is interesting about Erin's work is there's a familiarity. If you've been in Ohio for any length of time, there's a familiarity with the landscapes that he's depicting. And certainly this scene here with the cloudscape.
Yeah, let's come over here.
And I'd like you to come in closely too. So from a distance, the clouds are kind of, you can get that sense of movement, but up close, they really are abstracted into the dot pattern that silkscreen is so closely associated with. And I think there's a really interesting juxtaposition between the natural world and the man-made world. And part of what inspired this work is the beauty of the sunsets, the richness of the red and the orange in the Hocking Hills area, while striking, is also an indication of chemicals that are present in our atmosphere. So in his work, he's calling attention to both kind of the beauty of a place, but really the necessity that it takes, that they require care. He wants you to really kind of engage with the landscape intellectually. So it's not just a straightforward depiction. He's photographing it, he's breaking it down. It's becoming just a dot pattern and then broken down into books here, repeated into looping videos. So he really wants you to kind of pause and think about your relationship to a landscape and really think about that it requires our care.
I think it's really smart the way that it's hung too. The way that it's made, you said books, they are books, they accordion style to a really small format. And the way that he's hung them, it's down from what you would expect so that the base kisses the floor and gives almost this little channel. There are just these really nuanced details that happen in Erin's work that beg the viewer to be curious. Why did he choose this? And then it kind of cyclically allows entry to those additional topics, which is great.
And here it is at the front of the kind of by the title of the gallery. His work really speaks to that idea of a sequence as well. So the way that he's trying to describe or portray an overall image is by breaking it down, is by showing it as a series of things, as something that's kind of broken down into smaller parts. So I thought, certainly visually it really connects with that idea.
Yeah. So we have the prints over here and then the video here, and they are directly related to each other. So when you come to have a look in person, make sure that you investigate both. And so I think we'll come around the corner here to Tara.
So she is an artist who is living and working in the Toledo area, actually a recent graduate of the University of Toledo. But what I think is really interesting about her work is the use of layering. And that really speaks to something that printmaking does really well, where she's using images from her native Iran. So she grew up there, she studied there and received a degree in Tehran, and then another degree, both her degrees are in finance, another degree in Manchester, England, and then was at the University of Toledo studying art. So her journey as an artist has been it's been enriched by these other life experiences. And in her work, she's using patterns and motifs from ancient Persian culture. It's an ancient culture of artists working in many different media. And she's using these patterns that are familiar to her and familiar to her culture, but she's overlaying them so densely that they almost blur out. You kind of lose the specificity of them. But within these patterns, one image particularly stands out, the image of a pomegranate. So this one I'd like to point out. And the pomegranate's actually laser engraved on top of the silkscreen elements. So a pomegranate is very important in Persian culture. It's important in celebrations, but it's also, and Tara kind of is connected just with it visually, the shape, the color, but it's such a great metaphor for an idea of something being unique and whole, but in this unique and whole kind of fruit, it is full of seeds, it's full of possibilities, it's full of a lot of different directions. So I kind of see this as a really beautiful metaphor for what Tara's kind of articulating in her work of being from more than one culture, of that kind of tension of being kind of a whole person, but of many pieces, and many possibilities.
Perfect. All right, let's come around to Ross here. So I've got a series from Ross Mazupapa, who teaches up at Bowling Green, a series of photolithographs here, titled Signal Void. And then I also have a series that's done with iron oxide, rust. And yes, he's in Bowling Green, but Ross is truly a son of Youngstown, Ohio. So Ross's family goes back generations, both on his mom and dad's side, in Youngstown, Ohio. And what I think's really compelling about the series is that the depiction of this empty sign is such a great kind of stake in the ground, such a great image that really talks about some of the history of spaces like Youngstown, Ohio, spaces within the Rust Belt that have really had an arc that's changed over time, spaces that were built up to accommodate an industry, and then as jobs from the industry have left, the space has really changed. Something that Ross and I talked about is because his family is from there, and so his understanding of that space, what I think is really interesting, he talked about how growing up after the last kind of the jobs left, that he heard so many stories of what the place once was. So that was so much a part of his growing up that for him, this idea of the space that once was and what it is presently really kind of overlap in understanding and overlap in memory. And I think the images of the signs are such a great visual picture of what that is, of both past and present merging together. And for me, I see some of them almost like a portal. So with the signs where they're so empty that you see beyond them. You see the skyscape. You know, kind of going back to some of the other works in the show. You see something that's ever present, that's always changing. It has a much longer history to these spaces. And I think again that idea that so many senses of time or memory all kind of converge at the same. It's also
moment.
smartly tinted. The coloring that he uses is kind of sepia toned, right? And we always think about memory as sepia toned. So there are multiple layers there. There's also a sadness to it. Like
I think there's a melancholy, yeah.
For sure.
And I definitely want to point out this one here with the traffic cone. This one really stood out to me. It's created, that rust color is rust, it is iron oxide. And what I think is so compelling about this piece is Ross takes, could you come up with a more humble object than an old traffic cone? And this is an object that has outlived its usefulness, but he depicts it, he treats it with such reverence, with such care. And to me, the peeling parts almost feel like petals from a flower. I mean, he just treats this object with such tender, loving care. It almost feels personified. He really imbues it with a lot of emotion. And for me too, he kind of takes the story of an area of the Rust Belt and he brings it down to an individual, which I think is so powerful.
Wonderful. And so now that brings us over to Terrence.
It's not subtle. Terrence Hammond is an artist who's in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Come into the light.
Thank you.
Over here.
And his work really speaks, like Kat was referring to, from a distance. It has this decorative wallpaper that just grabs you as you walk right in the door, and that's intentional. So Terrence is using the visual language and the materials of the decorative world, so wallpaper. Here we have ceramic works in that blue on white, like Delft pottery. He's using a visual language that's usually something that's meant to be comforting, it's meant to be decorative, but he plays with it, he inverts it. So as you come up close, then you discover that he's put within the wallpaper, there's a fist that's part of the wallpaper, and then he is including images of protest, images from history. I want to point out this one here with James Baldwin. And this wallpaper is from a larger series called Protest Wallpaper. And what he's doing with the work is inviting a conversation into an understanding of representation. He works with images from the civil rights, but he's also using contemporary images. And what I was really struck by in Terrence's work is how much the images from the civil rights movement, how contemporary they feel, and how in a way, historic the contemporary images feel. A key to understanding Terrence's work is repetition, so that the images are repeated, that they're described as wallpaper. And I really really gave me pause to think about that he has a library of these images. And something that he's really saying is, I could keep going.
Yeah.
I could continue to they're so inundated by these images, in our culture, they've become the background. And he's really bringing in
It's a really interesting thing to think about. If it happens so many times, does it become noise then, right? And you think about that with decorative motifs. So this is a damask style. And the other thing that I think is really important about Terrence's work is that he is linking history to today. He's making us think about how can we look back to understand now, and we should, right?
Absolutely.
So like damask wallpaper, you have from the 16th, 15th century, all the way back, they think it was in Tang Dynasty, right? That was printing it in China. And you think about also the works in ceramics, same deal, like super early China Dynasty. Also, then the English took it on as like the most sought after to have, white porcelain with blue. These are, Terrence is very smartly linking past to present. He is taking us on a journey, if you're willing to go, and helping us contextualize our existence today and asking us to be to not let it become decorative.
Absolutely.
Right? To see it.
To see it and to engage with the conversation that his work really brings up. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Let's come around the corner and have a look at Ellen's work.
So this is the work of Ellen Jean Price. And Ellen is retired from Miami University, Professor Emeritus, pardon me, and is so in Oxford, Ohio. And Ellen's work, the way that I would describe her work is it whispers. So some artwork shouts, some artwork just to be even heard contextually, and some artwork kind of speaks in room volume. But Ellen's work, in my view, it whispers. You really have to kind of lean in, you have to look closely and kind of piece together the story that she's trying to tell. She doesn't just give you all the details. And I think that's really key to understanding her work. So when I met Ellen and spoke with her, a really key part of her story is that she's a biracial person. She grew up in New York in the 60s, and growing up, she was questioned all the time. And so what...
and when you say question, you mean people would say, what are you? Right?
Like,
and so that would have a huge impact on someone, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's a really interesting tie-in to think about the whispering of the work.
So the way that I see her body of work, and in talking with her and getting to know her better, is Ellen is really able to control the narrative. So she shares with you as much information as she wants, and she's able to use printmaking to do that. And I think that's really very powerful, that as an artist and as a printmaker to do that, and makes the viewer kind of think about it. So with that, some of the kind of clues or things that you'll see in her work is you'll see a figure, looks like a man, and just knowing that this work is connected to her story, you kind of assume maybe it's Ellen, but you're not really certain. But you see a man and a young child, these kind of organic marks, and you're starting to wonder, well, what's their relationship, or what's the relationship between these two figures and the marks here. This one here is called File 1951. We've talked about how she doesn't typically use text, and text is probably the easiest thing for people to connect with. And if you look closely, you can see some dates in here. So this is 1961. We've got some other numbers here. And then you see the end of a word, munist. So with the context of the dates, assume communist. And so this work actually came from a file folder that she requested from the US government. And so what I think is interesting with Ellen is she's still learning her own story too. She still has her own questions about who she is too, which is why, as we all do, we all kind of wonder where we come from, what our family history is. And Ellen's there's been expectations for her to answer it in a certain way, but here in the work, she's able to interpret it and in the way that she chooses to, which I think is really powerful.
Too. What I love about that quietness is that it requires a viewer to come close. You can't have multiple people looking closely at a work and absorbing the sensitivities of it. And I think that's a really nice extension of that conversation of you must engage intimately to be able to absorb all of the bits that this artist has selected to give. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. Perhaps we want to talk about engaging with the work.
Yeah.
So,
Andrew, why don't you pop on in there, and Christine can kind of take us through auditorially.
So this is an installation by the work of Rebecca Ann Wilhelm. Rebecca is an artist who's in the Cleveland area. She is a trained printmaker, but she really takes printmaking, and she does, these mirrors are technically prints. The image of a chain link fence has been silkscreened onto the mirror. But she really takes printmaking conceptually. So the idea of a mirror image, here it is, quite literally, and working with a lot of opposites. What I want to point out with Rebecca's work is the image of a chain link fence. That's the only image that's a part of this installation. Otherwise, it's projections of a chain link fence, light that's, you're kind of caught within a web as you come and interact with it. You are kind of caught with your own profile within this chain link fence. And a fence is a barrier. A fence is something that prevents one party from meeting another party. And I think Rebecca really just so astutely kind of touches on something of a cultural nerve. So a chain link fence is not a white picket fence. You know, it's a barrier that's used in industrial spaces. It's used in prison spaces. It's used not just backyards. It's a barrier that you may have strong emotional feelings towards when you see it. And here as a projection, here as a mirror, you're caught within it. And she really conflates the idea of being, it's really unclear which side of the barrier you're on, and that's really key to understanding the work. The work is titled The Space in Between, and so she really kind of takes the viewer, takes kind of all these, takes these kind of different cultural ideas of being inside and being outside, being rejected, being protected, and she conflates them. She really talks about a space where you're both, not one or the other. And I think that, again, kind of touches on a cultural nerve, but there's also just an element to, there's looking at yourself in the mirror. You can't help but step into the space and engage with it. You can't help but be caught. And the other thing too, when I first saw it in person, you can't investigate, you can't learn more without being caught, which I think is really something to think about.
Perfect. All right, so we have one last artist we're going to chat on, and so we'll come out here and talk about Art Berger.
So I could not curate there's many great printmakers here in Ohio, in the state of Ohio. Art Berger is a professor emeritus at OU in Athens and has been recognized world over with his mezzotints. And I've definitely met with former people who consider him a mentor, speak so highly of him. And so he's been recognized for his mezzotints. In the printmaking world, a mezzotint is the most labor-intensive process. Printmaking is technical, it is process heavy, but mezzotint kind of takes it to another level. And so his images are these beautiful, cinematic, detailed, soft images, but the way that they're created, they're made from a plate that's been prepared so it can print only black, and then the artist would go back in and smooth, use a burnisher to smooth areas that would typically receive ink to create light tones from black. So the way a mezzotint is prepared is it's a metal plate that
use a rocker. It's like a rocker.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's got teeth in it, and you have to systematically rock it like counterclockwise, like a clock. That way. It takes hours. And so.
But a plate like this would take more than hours.
It would take people. It would take. It's likely he has. It's not just him.
Yeah.
He's got a team that are helping create these prints, and it's really just physically incredible, regardless of how many people that you have a mezzotint at this size. But beyond that, the imagery that he kind of, again, he takes it to another level. So the process is involved, but in some of the images, he's overlapping them. This is an aquatint and an etching, which is no less technical and beautiful. And this is actually the first work of his that I saw. It was part of a printmaking portfolio organized by a former student of his. And I like how the image is these multiple images that are overlapping. And for me, his overall body of work feels very cinematic. They feel like they're movie stills where you just see just a clip and you don't see what came before, you don't see afterwards. And so some of these overlapping images, for me, it's like something's fading out while something's fading in, and you're kind of caught in between.
Yeah, it's that liminal space. Yeah.
It's a good word. It's a good word. So there's a resting figure, but there's also a tension in his work. So again, we've got another really intimate interior scene. You're kind of caught in all those details. But then when you really think about it, you're a voyeur. You're really seeing it from a great distance. You're not a part of that scene. You have a distance from it. You're kind of seeing it from a distance.
You would never naturally have this view.
No, you're hovering above.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I think it's great for us to end on the super technical and, as you said, world-renowned mezzotint artists. I mean, all of these artists are really
and they know each other.
Phenomenal.
I do want to point that out too.
Yeah.
Printmakers, they know each other, which I think is really
And if
special.
they don't know each other, they know of each other, which is also really exciting. So it's been a pleasure to get to work with you, Christine, and have you pull together these 14 phenomenal printmakers from across the state. Again, this is Sequence. It's here at the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery, and I want to take a moment to thank the governor, the legislature, and the Ohio Arts Council's board for supporting the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists.